Ken and I answering questions. So welcome to our experimental Ask Ken and Robin virtual Zoom panel. So Ken, I believe you know the drill here. When we start off these our live panels, we begin with the nerdtrope cards. These, of course, are supplied to us by our good friend Cal of Tate. We have a deck of nerd cards. We have a deck of trope cards. And
we have not met.
We have not met. We have not met. We've never met before. We're completely unaware of one another.
Right.
And I'm now going to assign you the... oh, we had that one before. We had that one before. Oh, we haven't had that. Oh, Cat won't like that one. We're also not going to do that one. The 100 Years' War.
The 100 Years' War. Selected at random.
Selected at random.
Literally.
And
that's called the Magician's Force, people, by the way.
Magician's Force.
If you're not familiar with that.
And also, we're also not going to do kitchen sink draw 5 more trope cards.
We are not going to do that, no.
Because this is our experimental first panel.
Right, yeah.
So we're going to do pod people.
Pod people. Pod people.
So we're doing the 100 Years' War, Ken.
100 Years' War.
And pod people.
It relates to pod people.
As it relates to pod people.
All right. Okay. The first thing to establish is that the question obviously is this the 100 Years' War fought between two competing teams of pod people, or is one or the other of the sides influenced, corrupted, taken over by pod people? And I think probably when you examine the question of which side it is that went about in sort of slovenly, slack behavior and didn't pick up their lawn, which we know is a sign of the pod people from Jack Finney's immortal novel, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and generally went about things with no eye to the aesthetics. We know that that must be the English, because the French obviously are classy. They've got the fancy armor, they have the whole 9 yards, and also it beggars the imagination. And I ask you to imagine this, that at random, the Welsh longbow should be a game-breaking invention in warfare, a thing that happened only during that little window of the 100 Years' War. Right after the 100 Years' War, they stopped Welsh longbowing. If it's this great super weapon, you'd think they'd have been using it all the way down to World War I. But no, they just stopped. They just, blew it off. It stopped happening. And everyone's like, gunpowder. Oh,
they
the
switched
Black
from,
Death. Oh.
Yeah, they switched from long bows just to long words.
Exactly, right. And before the 30 Years' War, they're not really going bananas with the Welsh longbow. The Welsh longbow just springs up out of nowhere at the Battle of Cressy, annihilates a bunch of perfectly innocent French people who are just wandering about, trying to maintain the dignity of the feudal order. So when you ask which side has lower aesthetic standards and which side has a mysterious super weapon, the answer is obviously it's the English. So now that we've established that the English are the pod people and the French are the forces of humanity, broadly speaking, you have to say that where did the first pod people come down? And what is the Santa Mira, if you will, of the outbreak? And obviously, since we've just talked about how it's the Welsh longbow, we know it must be in Wales. There must have been a meteor that struck or some other kind of an event in Wales, possibly connected with Halley's Comet, which was in the sky in the early 1300s. Possibly connected with the Green Children of Woolpit, which we've already discussed. Possibly connected with some sort of adventure at sea in which the pods fell to Earth and then floated onto land. And indeed, we remember a previous expedition to Wales by the Romans, who of course were very concerned to burn out all the Druid groves. And now we're maybe beginning to get somewhere, because what would the Druids be venerating in those groves that would be vegetable-like and susceptible to being burned out? Why, it must have been pods, alien pods. So perhaps the alien pods go even farther back to Julius Caesar times. And that's why Boudica's rebellion was so terrifying to everyone, because she had threatened to find the store of pod people and deal with them, swap out her leading lieutenants, and that's why she was able to destroy the entire Roman infrastructure in Britain in a matter of weeks, and why it took so many legions to put a minor provincial rebellion like that back down. So we're establishing that the pods came down possibly in the earliest times of ancient Britain, that they were centered on the island of Anglesey in Wales, the Druidic Mona, which of course the Romans took care to burn out all of the sacred groves of. Again, a thing that was not their standard practice. If you look at their attitude with other religions, it was very live and let live, and whatever you want to do, as long as pour out a 40 to the emperor, we're all cool with it. They had a very specific anti-Druid, anti-Welsh attitude. So we've established a secret pod person lineage going back through Wales. It pours out, bringing with it its super weapon under the cover of the Welsh longbow, as if that's a thing, and they bring it to invade France. And of course, they win a series of famous victories. They're obliterating English armies left and right, and yet somehow they can't get it together to finish the job. And that's another sign that it's pod people. Pod people have obviously some sort of collective action problem at the large size. It's the same instinct that prevents them being able to pick up their yard and bother to remember all the details of the human life that they're impersonating, and so they wind up unable to seal the deal. But of course, they're pod people, so they are spreading. You have more and more French nobles being turned. The Burgundians go over to the pod people, and it literally takes a intervention from different powers. And these powers, I don't know what you want to say they are. Maybe it's God, maybe it's the fairies, maybe it's the fairies working for God. Fairies, I think the fairies by then have got a pretty good sense of who's in charge. But they set up Joan of Arc, who, what do we know about her? She hears voices. She's superhumanly charismatic, again, the opposite of pod people in every way. And probably, remember, she had superpowers of detection, because she could detect the Dauphin in a crowd of people in the French court, having never seen any of them. So perhaps she was gifted the fairy sight, the ability to see pod people wherever they were. And that's the turning point. Suddenly the Battle of Orleans goes the other way. The pod people are falling. The French are able to target them with crossbows or whatnot. And the English cause in France completely disintegrates over a matter of 30 years. It takes, from the Battle of Orleans, the turning point there, it takes barely 25 years before the French are completely victorious in every corner of the country, something they were totally unable to do before Joan of Arc. So we've demonstrated Joan of Arc, superpowers, able to spot people hiding in crowds. English, sloppy, possess a super weapon that somehow is not relevant before or after. I think the case is made, Rob, and I think I've demonstrated this. I think Arnold Toynbee would come back from the dead and say, "Why have I been brought back from the dead? What necromancy do you command?" But then he would say, "Yeah, that's right."
So thank you, Ken, for that magnificent nerd trope. And I would also like to thank our format for allowing me to figure out how the heck Zoom works while Ken has an extended monologue at the beginning. And now
it's as though it was some sort of plan.
It's all planned in advance. Usually it sucks to be prescient when you write horror and science fiction, but here was one instance where prescience is paying off. Oh, here we go.
All right, yeah.
Here we got Mike QL.
Hello. You must by now have done a fair bit of the online gaming, assuming you are not giving up this hobby purely because for cosmic disaster. What bits have you been finding hard, and what bits have you been thinking, yeah, this format is something I could really do something with this format, maybe something different?
The thing that I find hard most of all is sitting in a less comfortable chair for the length of time of a session. And so one of my bits of advice, first of all, is to just take it easy on everybody comfort-wise, because I've moved my online group, or sorry, my offline group online, and we're all used to sitting in furniture of at least some degree of comfortableness, and now we're all sitting in our computer chairs. So the first point I would make is make the sessions somewhat shorter, and sort of the process of taking breaks becomes a little more formal. And also just the other big struggle, of course, is just everybody fighting with their devices, because one of the participants in the first session went, "Oh, I've got to make sure all my devices are charged because I'm losing battery power partway through." So weirdly, for me anyway, we're playing Gumshoe, so that's mostly dialogue. It doesn't require a battle map or anything like that. So I'm not dealing with the challenge of Roll20, for example, but I am dealing with just sort of the different physical nature of the experience. Ken?
I think for me, it's been an interesting study in contrast. I've got two games right now. One is my 13th Age game, and one is my Fall of Delta Green game. And my 13th Age game skews older and involves Roll20. So it has been, I don't want to say clunkier, but there's been a bigger learning curve. And a lot of it is just getting used to the tech, what can and can't Roll20 do, what does and doesn't it make easier and better than face-to-face play. And we'll figure that out, and I think that's just a learning curve, and we'll get it. But the differential in feedback, I find, is the thing that you need to keep in mind as the GM anyways, because when I'm running a game face-to-face, I can get instant feedback from any player just by looking at them. I know he's a little bit tapped out. He's interested. She's curious but wary to see where I'm going with this. I can get immediate GM feedback at all times, and that bandwidth just doesn't exist online. Even if you're playing on the camera, you're not always looking at the camera. You're not doing the same facial responses that you are to the GM in life. And so I think that something that, fortunately, the degree of struggling with Roll20 that we're doing is preventing me from going off on any particularly wild riffs. But I think that it's going to impose a slightly more conservative play style on me, just because I have to make sure that I only go somewhere that I'm pretty sure everyone else is willing to go without getting check-in all the time visually. And so if you're playing a horror game, it's much more important, I think, to be super aware of what your players are responding anyway, and it's much harder to do that online. Again, my Fall of Delta Green game is it's on Discord for the sound and on Slack for the interaction, which is almost how it's been anyway. We've been running with Slack as an on-table thing since the face-to-face days, just because it's a great way to put up, handouts and, hey, this is the, dolmen that you're standing near. Here's a picture of it at night. Here's the weird rock formation that I found in Colorado that looks like a serpent man built it, but it's real because I found it on Google Images. Boom. And then that, here's the fossil that they're talking about. Oh, that is creepy looking. Thank you. That was disturbing. Here are the, weird pictures that a crazy person found in a locker in New York and claims indicate a secret government base. So let's say that they do. And here's what you see when you go to the secret government base, and things like that. And so that aspect of it is the same as it is on face-to-face, but I am not able necessarily to get the immediate feedback that I am in terms of this horror element? Is it working? Is it playing? Is it a little too far? What's going on? So that, I think, is the biggest hurdle for me as a GM, is that one of your big feedback channels is missing. And because it's a feedback channel that is completely outside the player's control 90% of the time, they don't even know that it's missing for you, because they're not aware they're giving you that feedback consciously. I mean, if they stop to parse it out, they'd figure, oh yeah, obviously he must be licking our faces, duh. But it's harder to but it's a channel that mostly is only feeding me information, and now the players, it's not their job to run it, but it has to be more of a two-way street, because you simply can't gather the level of data on player response, and that's the biggest challenge that I've found so far. I mean, everyone in my Fall of Delta Green group is like 30 years younger than me, so they're all super capable of mastering the technology and making it all work. But we are, there's going to be the one person who's got a bunch of roommates, and so they're all watching Netflix. So the bandwidth is super laggy in her apartment, and that's just, and it's unfair, because that happens to be, as it is in this case, one of the really good role players in the group. It's like, well, that's where she really shines, is that sort of emotional, personal connection. And now I have to figure out, how do I make sure that she has something to play at in the game, because her big weapon has been taken away by the technology.
Yes, because of lag, you're now a casual player.
Right. Sorry.
Welcome to the game. Yeah, but that's the other thing that I found too, is it's harder to see when someone is not getting spotlight time, and I think that's compounded by the fact that someone who may be more conscious about taking their share of spotlight time may become more of a spectator in the online format. Normally, the problem with casual gamers is trying to figure out, do you want the spotlight time, or are you happy to sit back? Here I've had an A/B test where I see a player who is somewhat less participatory online, and I'm going to have to pay more attention to, has Josie gotten her scene in this time around? Yeah. Hey.
So I have a question about you guys a few times, and I think especially Robin, but I believe both of you have kind of denigrated James Campbell and the hero's journey. And do I mean
Joseph Campbell?
Joseph Campbell, thank you. Yeah. And the hero's journey. And you never explained why. You just kind of, and everybody else seems to love it and swear by it, and both of you have kind of been like, not so much. I'm curious to hear your analysis or your complaints about that structure.
So Joseph Campbell is something of a shoehorner.
Yeah.
And will
put it mildly.
Yeah, to put it mildly. And so he'll knock the edges off things, especially obscure cultural myths like the Bible, in order to make his points. And the consequence, though, of the shoehorning into his monomyth is that guess what? If you encourage a generation of, in particular, Hollywood screenwriters to write to the same formula, they will all write to the same damn formula. And I believe that it should be the province of any writer to set out to demolish formulas, to try and find different ways to do things. And taking the monomyth and making it into a structure for every heroic story is, first of all, results in a sameness, and also fails to address the most common variety of hero story in our pulp literature, which is the iconic hero, the hero who is cyclical, who does not go on a single transformative journey that remakes themselves and then completes their tale with these set of stations along the way, but rather continually reiterates in a cyclical fashion, and is not changed by the world, but rather changes the world back into shape. So Ken, would you like to continue blackguarding Campbell?
I would love to continue blackguarding Campbell. Yeah, and it's not as though Myth has any examples of a hero who just does a lot of really cool adventures. Anyway, yeah. So the monomyth. I mean, like they say, by their fruits you shall know them. The fruits is a bunch of terrible movie scripts and a bunch of movies that, even if it was true, even if the monomyth was the actual way myth works, which it is not, it's also a terrible story. It just, if you do all the stages of the monomyth, the first 2 acts, nothing happens. Because you got to meet the hero, then they have to be aware of a problem, then they have to refuse the call for some stupid reason. You're halfway through the movie and nothing is going on. This is just it's a terrible recipe for a script.
Right. It is accurate though in role playing, because then the players don't get on the plane.
Right. Yeah.
So you do have to. So if he called it the premise rejection, perhaps I would buy into that.
Well, no, and again, as an empirical description of human psychology, it's still a rotten story.
Yes. The critical not get off the couch phase.
Right, but over and above the fact that it makes for terrible story, it's also, as Robin alluded, wrong. Joseph Campbell is not just a knocker off of corners, he is an ignorer of data that do not fit his pre-established thesis. His pre-established thesis being Warmdomer Jungianism, and Jung, God save the mark, at least never tried to. I mean, he would say that there was only, the archetypes existed, but he would never get himself pinned down on these are them and here's their story and this is what happens. Jung was very much, here's a pattern that I've seen, and it's very much like, tea leaf reading, which again, great, maybe not, a reason to rethink the way that the human mind works, but whatever, knock yourself out, Carl. But again, Joseph Campbell also says, I'm going to share Jung's hideous anti-Semitism, and I'm going to make it a big part of it. And that is a big reason that, as Robin says, he neglects and indeed distorts Bible stories, which, again, over and above being bad anthropology, is also, it takes away the whole the whole reason that you claim that the monomyth works is it's worked in the Bible, the biggest story of all. It's like, well, you got the Bible wrong, so clearly it didn't. So yeah, he's a terrible human being, a terrible anthropologist, a mediocre writer at best, and the results of his actions are uniformly pernicious and terrible. So what can I say? I mean, it's like if Margaret Murray were still getting strange respect from people. It's just banana land. And Margaret Murray, God save the mark, wasn't an anti-Semite. She was just a crazy person.
Chad.
There we go, unmuted. Yeah, I posted a question in the chat, but it's y'all have talked quite a bit about Umberto Eco's Foucault's Pendulum, but much less about Charles Portis's Masters of Atlantis. I was wondering if y'all were up for a little compare and contrast.
Robin, you're the guy that turned me on to Charles Portis. Why don't you do your monologue, and I'll figure out what's going on.
Right. Well, I love Charles Portis, first of all, and his beautiful, understated prose style, his subtly hilarious dialogue. In a way, he reminds me a lot of Jack Vance, although not quite as stylized as Vance. But I remember in particular in his novel Norwood, there's a great sentence that just the rock pankled down the roof. There's just sort of an exquisite economy about his wry sense of humor. And Masters of Atlantis, this is the first time I would have been invited to think about that in its relation to Umberto Eco, because of course it is less about a grand conspiracy. It's less about the facts of sort of Masonic / theosophical / Rosicrucian myth leaking into the real world and becoming part of a thriller plot, as just a look at the curious artifact of the fact that all of these small town dudes in the early part of the century were, as part of their civic engagement, attuned to all of these rituals and mystical flim-flam, which of course was just a reason to have a bonding ritual, and then in some cases to drive around in tiny cars in between drinking sessions. So I think Portis's Masters of Atlantis is kind of a beautiful corrective to the thriller take on the occult. It's a book where nothing overtly interesting or thrilling happens to a group of small-town occultists.
Which makes it not ideal game fodder, I guess.
No.
Compared to Foucault's Pendulum, right? I mean, it's worth reading as literature and like Robin says, for the pleasures of the language. But again, especially I think if you and because he's deliberately sort of keeping the tone and the focus quotidian, it doesn't have the vastness of scope that, I mean, the great thing about Foucault's Pendulum is that every time you think you've got a handle on what's happening, Echo pulls another drawer out and there's more craziness pouring out, whereas with Masters of Atlantis, the scope is, like you say, this small town, mindset, and it sort of stays that. It doesn't really go anywhere. It's more of a, how can you stand to live in Nebraska type question rather than what is the cosmic meaning of the conspiratorial mindset type question.
Right, because even if you did it in drama system, you would have to have all the players agree up front that nothing mystical is ever really going to happen. That it's all still a small town, low-key comedy, and that they may talk constantly about the occult, making them like real-world occultists. But without fancy scarves.
I was going to say that at this point, it would seem simpler just to start a magical circle.
Well, again, there's always the danger that actual magic will break.
That's true. There is some danger.
Frank Redding, your hand is up.
Unmuted. Hello. Okay, I have a slightly different question, but going back a bit to playing online more. But previously, you would create, bring snacks that you share around the table, like crisps and stuff like that. What is the go-to snack food now that you can have it all for yourself while you're eating by yourself online?
So my greatest heresy, of course, as a game designer, is that I do not actually snack while I play. There's one for Halloween. One of the players brings around donuts from Krispy Kreme, and I can't resist those. But I'm not a snacker. So I have noticed, however, that suddenly in online play, more beers have appeared than previously been a feature of my gaming. Ken?
I think I snack more during face-to-face games just because the vibe is different, right? It's like, in an ideal world, I mean, yes, beers may or may not appear, but you're more likely to eat and drink if you're with other people convivially than if you're just sitting there for 7 hours at your computer. I have a bag of M&Ms, peanut M&Ms by my computer that is basically the protein and sugar combo that is ideal for writing, but eating M&Ms while running something that depends 95% on spoken word is a terrible idea. So I just sort of control my snackly urges during online play now. I can come to the advantage is that I can come to the table right after dinner, so I'm not remotely hungry. And also, I guess the other advantage is usually during the Monday night game, the first hour of game is recap / waiting for the food / eating the food because we order out. And so we don't do that now. So we are suddenly gifted with an extra hour of game time that I don't know if anyone is sure what to do with. Fortunately, Roll20 has figured out what to do at that time.
Which is you spend it figuring out Roll20.
Yeah, is not uploading things. And so the But my I can't be eating M&Ms because that would sound terrible on the microphone. And anything else that I would want to eat is going to be similar. So yeah, if we're in a situation where we have a lot of excess beer or this keeps going on, I can visualize a world where my snacks will be in liquid form. But for right now, I'm just sort of eating a big dinner before, gaming right through after, drinking the sodas and whatnot, and then if I'm hungry after the game, I can have a sandwich or I can do whatever. I don't really nosh during game now. It's just sounds gross.
and if I may be permitted a useful tip, don't forget the social purpose of that time that you used to spend everybody eating their takeout, or in Ken's case, everybody eating their communal takeout, because that's the social time. And the whole reason that gaming is a blessing during this terrible outbreak is it gives us an opportunity to be with each other in a social situation, and to, whenever I participate in something like what we're doing right now, I find that my sense of dread around this whole situation leavens for a little while. And so make sure that you continue to socialize, and don't, because the thing about online gaming is it imposes an efficiency, which in many ways is a blessing. There's less kibitzing and less off-topic banter, but the medium sort of wants you to eliminate that entirely, and you have to fight against that a bit, I would argue. Sam Tyler. Sam Tyler, did you have your hand up? Have we lost Sam?
Sorry about that. Had a little
there you are.
Pop up there. Ken, I'm a big fan of Day After Ragnarok. It's my favorite setting. I just love to know, is there more coming? Is there any chance we could get a second edition? And if the answer is no, I'd love to know what happens when you advance the timeline. Like, how far into the Twilight of the Gods do we go in the 50s?
That's a lovely question. As always, there are more good ideas than there is time to do them. I will say that neither Hal nor I have admitted to ourselves that we're done. I have, let me see if I can find it. No, it's under a giant pile of things. I'm not going to pull it out. All the books would topple. But right here, there is a book called Metropolis of the American Nile, which is about Memphis, Tennessee, and it's about all the wild stuff going on in Tennessee. I've got a book of Tennessee legends from, I don't know where it's from, and I've got the Federal Writers Project Guide to Mississippi, and they're all right here by my work table, which are my reminder to myself that I need to at least write Memphis Entry to the Poison Lands, because I promised I would do it forever ago. We've got a couple of things in-house that if I could decide to make the time to edit, I could edit them. Maybe I will suddenly find the time, who can say? And Hal and I both very much want to do a refurb, bring it up to New Savage Worlds at least. The Savage Worlds has got the new edition, so it'd be nice to sort of nip and tuck there. I think that the book is pretty much, like you say, people really like it as it is. There's no real changes I would make to the book, but the various rules systems it's for have gone through their evolution, so it might be worth looking at that. And then how far into it, one of the things I like about the setting is that what happens later, besides probably terrible things, is sort of up to the GM. And so I do not have a World of Darkness style meta plot in my head that says, oh, by 1959, X thus and so will happen. It's kind of up to every individual group. But I will say that the next big thing I do for the book is called 500 Years After Ragnarok. And it will be a sort of a Flash Gordon, Buck Rogers version of the Robert E. Howard setting that we have now. And if you remember in the first words of the book, it says, between the drowning of America and the rise of the sons of space, which I just made up because I needed something that would riff off Robert E. Howard's Between the Drowning of Atlantis and the Rise of the Sons of Arius. And so I said, space is future-y, I'll put that in. And then Hal, my publisher, Hal Mangold, my beloved publisher and boon companion Hal Mangold, said, who are the Sons of Space? What's that? I want to know all about that. Ken, tell me about that. And that really was the impetus to say, all right, who are the Sons of Space? What goes on? And it's pretty great. I think it's as good a high concept, or maybe almost as good a high concept, as the Midgard serpent falling to Earth. So if I ever get around to doing it, maybe post-Hellenistica, maybe during Hellenistica, depending on how the timing works out, that will be the next thing that I do, the next big thing. But I do want to do Memphis for that setting before I completely abandon it, even if I never get around to 500 years after. I think that the chances of seeing either of them are good, but not good in any particular year. It's like a White Sox pennant, you know. At any point, it could happen, and then something happens, usually in April, that dooms it. And so there we are.
Well, Ken, I understand the Buck Rogers RPG license is available.
The best thing is that Armageddon 2419 is public domain, so I don't need it.
Next question is from Paul.
Hi, I was actually looking for GM advice on if you're playing a game that's partially based on historical events, slotting a player character into the role of an actual historical figure.
So my experience with that is with the Dreamhounds of Paris campaign, and I think that works best if everybody is a historical figure, because otherwise you are changing the burden that some players have, and that can be a challenge in that some of the players may or may not be as interested in the available cast of characters as you have. It assumes that the players are going to do a bunch of research and get into that character. And you, who have presumably done all the research ahead of time too, may want to cast certain characters with certain players. So there was an obvious person in my group who had to be Dali, for example. So I assigned the role of Dali and then allowed the other players to pick things that were more like their typical players. So the one who was, less interested in surrealist nonsense figured that the most down-to-earth figure was Man Ray, for example. And so people wound up gravitating to characters who reflected their types. And part of that is also to make sure, as in Dreamhounds, that there's a bigger assortment of characters available, because you're asking for more of a burden, almost sort of an actorly burden, by requesting that people play historical figures. And of course you want to pick an era like Paris in the 20s and 30s that has an incredibly rich assortment of colorful, amazing people to choose from. Ken? I've been running back in my mind. I am not sure that I've ever run a game in which my players have played straight up historical figures, with the exception of 2 time travel games that I've run. And in one of them, about half the players picked not famous people, but people who, you could look up on Wikipedia. And the other half were like, I want to play, one player was basically playing Richard Francis Burton, but not a racist. And so they were like, I don't want to play Richard Francis Burton. He has very unsound opinions on foreigners. I would like to play a good version of Richard Francis Burton. So we made up a pretend Richard Francis Burton and gave him sort of, a rivalry with real Richard Francis Burton. So we had a built-in player hook, and that is how that went. And in my most recent epically historical game, besides the one that I'm running now, I guess the players could have said, I want to run a real Hellenistic figure, but no one did. Well, the Old West Unknown Armies game, again, people could have played genuine historical characters, but I think they had more fun playing the sort of Unknown Armies types who would then interact heavily with real historical characters. So that when they were in Tombstone, of course, everyone they tripped over was a real life NPC, because God forbid anyone should play in Tombstone 1881 if I'm running it, because you'll never get out of the setting. It's a nightmare. And so they interacted with them and were peers of them and were known to them in the best historical fiction tradition. But again, I was in a time travel game a long time ago as a player, where the GM's rule was you have to pick a historical person and explain how they, got out of how they were recruited into the time unit or whatever. And so the historical person I played was the Comte de Saint-Germain, as could have been obvious with the meanest intellect. And it was a real example of, no, he has a skill in that. Look. Yes.
I didn't make this up.
I also had someone play the Count de Saint-Germain at one point in an Over the Edge campaign.
Yeah, right.
And that was a perfect character for that.
Right. Yeah, so I mean, I could see doing it, but and I run very, very historically centered games, obviously, starting with Earth as I do, and I have no objection if someone comes to me and says, I want to play, beloved actor David Garrick. It's just that people would rather play the guy who hates beloved actor David Garrick and wants to ruin him and is consumed with jealousy of beloved actor David Garrick because they think that's a more fun way to interact with history, and I can't say they're wrong.
Yeah, I think people feel constrained by the actual facts of somebody's life. And so the trick is to make sure that there is some other venue for them to do things that are off the historical path. So that the secret world element has to be pretty strong. So that's why I have only tried to do this with Dreamhounds, because half the stuff they're doing is in the Dreamlands and therefore is not historically documented. And
right.
So you have the fun thing of we'd go off and meet Nyarlathotep in a Douanier Rousseau looking grove in the Dreamlands, and then we head back to this historically documented gallery opening where there was a big controversy. And so that's sort of a fun thing to do. So you might want to look at a formula that allows that to happen. And of course, the Dreamlands is already the perfect version of that, and I can't think of a better one.
Here I am. Thank you so much. As you may know, recently the community content guidelines for Ashen Stars has dropped. So I was just wondering, I know there's some information in the book, but I was just wondering, what would be some keys just to keep in mind to really make some compelling contracts?
So the way to do that is to think of the contract as having a compelling thing to do that for the lasers that is will turn out to be something different when they get there, but that the something different will still draw them into the story. The classic one is there's a stellar anomaly that they need readings from, but it's very there's some sort of danger that the anomaly is posing, so you need to both study the anomaly but also cancel out its threat. And then once you get to the anomaly, you find out that there's a godlike alien intelligence doing something, and so it's still within the bounds of the original contract, because you don't want the players going, well, we can't fulfill this one, let's just drive off. And so there's a sort of double game you're playing in terms of having a surprise that nonetheless they have to continue to resolve in order to fulfill the basis of the original contract. And Ken, that's an Ashen Stars question, so I think we can.
My notion on what makes a fun contract, if you go to the Ken Writes About Stuff Xenology one, there's a couple of contracts I think in the back of that are my notion of what's fun. But my theory is go back to old school Star Trek and rip something off. People love old school Star Trek. I mean, not as much as they should, but
Yes, and you can also go to a JAG episode and without even having to watch it, and just read the episode description on IMDb and put something science fiction-y in it if you're ever stuck. Okay, next we have Bob G. has his hand up.
Yeah, so I just had a quick question. My gaming group has been using this time where everyone has been stuck inside to read up on new game systems, or at least some of us have. And so the question I have is, do you have any tips for how to take, I've read 5 rule systems in the last 3 weeks and distill them down to, you can play in this game that I'm running for it now, without having to read 5 books in 3 weeks.
So I think this is a variant of the question of how much of the rules to explain when you first start playing to your players as you go along. So obviously the first step here is to pick which one of the 5 most appeals to you. And I would start with which one is going to be easiest to run online, which is essentially, you can shorten that sentence to which of these is easiest. And then, first of all, pitch it to your players in terms of, you are X who do Y, right? Tell them what the core concept of the game is right up front. So, you are freelance spacefaring law enforcement in a lawless area of galactic space who solve problems for money. And then as you're going along, you might want to have a session 0 is an opportunity to explain a lot of rules to people, but only explain the rules as you absolutely need to do so, because especially it's hard enough to learn rules from reading a text, but having your GM sort of go on a lengthy excursion explaining how they work is challenging. So in general, wait until it comes up, wait until you're asked, and there will be certain things during character generation that you will have to explain, but as much as possible go, well, we'll get to the feast throwing rules as soon as we have a feast. But until then, all you need to know is a high number in feasting is good and a low number is bad. And just sort of take them through, and you might want to then think about that old-fashioned technique of designing scenarios so that they have a tutorial effect. So in this hypothetical game that I'm now making up, feasting is very important. So you might want to have the first session be, the lead up to the feast. So the first thing is everybody makes the simplest possible version of the resolution mechanic, and then you go to the next most interesting, distinctive thing, have a scene that provokes that happening, and then finally the end of that session is the big feast, which has whatever consequences from it. So the short answer is give them rules information on a need-to-know basis, because that way they'll retain the information because they're actually making use of them.
I would say that you can use as a filter on which game to run, which games have quick start modules or quick start rules. If you have to read a 200-page book to play the game in a fun way, that's going to be less appealing and less practical than a game where you have to read 2 pages to start playing in a fun way. And if the game that you really want to run doesn't have a 2-pager, that can be a thing that you might want to do. And that, first of all, it's a great way to sort of teach yourself the game, in that you have boiled down, at least at your table, what are going to be the core competencies and core activities, because you've got to fit those mechanics into 2 pages. And you're also basically, before you spring it on the players, you're like, do I have an understanding of the game? Can I talk about this game in under 10 minutes? And if you can't, it's probably not the game to start running just on a wild whim, unless everyone is in a really freewheeling, experimental, let's do it and be heroes kind of a mode. If they are, great. You have a great game group and a great attitude. But if you have a bunch of things competing for your time, the one that is, I think, making the biggest attempt to minimize your on-ramping is the game to reward with your play. That's just a sort of a very pragmatic thought, but it's going to come back to bite you if you just all leap into the game that requires 600 pages to understand and realize that you don't like the game about 150 pages in.
Craig Maloney. Craig,
answering the question that's in our hearts.
Yes.
Yes.
Craig, are you still with us? Okay, Wayne R.
Hey, so in the last episode when you were talking about Lana Del Rio, sort of in the wrap up, you had mentioned something about how the Louisiana one had something to do with Esperanto. And I'm wondering if there's any good elliptonic nonsense that Ken knows about with Esperanto or any other constructed languages. It seems fertile. So,
I mean, it certainly does. And God forbid Darcy Ross should watch this, because she, in the beautiful way that she is all things, she is an Esperantist. And when I say this is going to seem hurtful to her. But I want to assure both Darcy and all Esperantists that I say this with love when I say there is nothing more tiresome and boring than Esperanto. Its origin its modality, its goals. They are like a frickin' city council meeting in a small liberal suburb. It is just everyone earnestly assuring people of things and talking nonsense. So there is no thing that I've ever run across in Esperanto specifically that is remotely occult or interesting. It's all very sort of, you know, goodness, world peace would be nice. Yeah, fine, whatever. Now the other conlangs get more bananas. And I'm not the big conlang guy, but my understanding is that Volapuk, the guy who invented Volapuk, was sort of tied into sort of not just the sort of general stew of 19th century anthropology, which is jammed in with the Aryan thesis and lots of other stuff, but I think he might have been specifically part of a weird Scandinavian mystical, and I use mystical in the small m. I don't think he was like an occultist or whatever, but I think he was part of like this sort of national mysticism that was a big part of the 19th century, and he was sort of responding to it by trying to make a universal language out of mostly Northern European construct. So I think Volapuk is maybe the one that I would dive into if I were looking for it. And then a lot of the other conlangs, because they're made up by eccentrics, I guarantee that if you dug into it, one or more of them would wind up, oh yeah, also he was a Freemason and a member of the, you know, Kibu Kift and whatever else craziness he got up to, because people who invent conlangs have the same, I think, sort of mind that gets other people into occultism, in that it's very connecty and interested in a lot of different things and pulls them together. And so it would not stun and amaze me to find that anyone who invented a conlang was also into other elliptonic belief structures. And again, perhaps I'm wrong, and perhaps the guy that made up Esperanto on the very DL was a UFO contactee. I don't know. It's just that nothing that I've ever read about Esperanto, and God knows, you know, I try not to, has convinced me that it's anything more than sort of, you know, a suburban lawn committee. And so it's, you know, you know, I don't want to bag on people's ridiculous hobbies. I mean, God knows I'm in no place to do so, but I have never found anything particularly wild about Esperanto, except that because it is a thing that people who are unhappy with the universe as it is do, a lot of them do wind up attracted into sort of weirdly fringe social structures like Lano del Rio or whatever. Philip Jose Farmer, of course, famously was an Esperantist and jammed it into his crazy novel. And Philip Jose Farmer, you know, that's a well of crazy that goes all the way down. But again, he's a novelist. There's nothing really interesting about his life. It's all in his fiction. So.
Craig Maloney, have you recovered from your computer woes?
I don't think you ever have that problem in panels, do you? Of someone just freezing up, do you?
Yes, it's more of an emergency if someone freezes up.
Yeah, if we have to reboot an audience member live, that's a problem.
One question I had was using Gumshoe 1-to-1 for a comedic setting. Have you given any thought to that? I know you talked the last episode that aired about screwball comedy, and I was wondering if something would be applicable for that.
So I guess there's two ways to go about that. One is in which it's just a lighthearted mystery, but it's still a mystery, as in The Thin Man, in which you just sort of construct a mystery, and there's even danger involved, but there's guardrails on how bad the bad results of the challenges are, so that instead of, you know, the edge card or the problem cards are not you've been critically wounded, but rather your tie has been damaged, or, you know, you spilled your drink on yourself, or you've committed a social faux pas. So that you know, one of the old sayings is that comedy is what is tragedy with the consequences sanded off. The other question is one in which it is a more overtly comedic setup in which failure takes you further into the mystery, and that would be Inspector Clouseau, right? So that you can only discover new scenes and new clues by undergoing some slapstick humiliation. And the challenge with that is that verbal descriptions of slapstick are difficult.
Not even dancing about architecture at that point.
Yes. And in
writing
general,
about dancing about architecture.
In general, comedy role-playing is tough to begin with, just because role-playing sessions are already sort of plenty funny because they're riffing off whatever level of seriousness you have in what it is that you're originally doing. So I would try to go for take a standard mystery structure and then make it sort of cute and funny and light rather than full-on Inspector Clouseau.
But if it turns out that you and your life partner are able to do Nick and Nora level repartee, I'm not sure. I mean, if you want to spend 4 hours playing a role-playing game, I'm sure that it'll be hilarious and fun, regardless of whether it's supposed to be a comedy mystery, because you're freaking Nick and Nora already. I mean, the thing about Screwball is so much of it is in the dialogue. I mean, it makes the Jack Vance challenge, almost seem nugatory, because it's not just about the lines; it's about the pacing, the delivery, and the overlap, and the building of emotional tension, and all of that stuff. That if you have that dynamic with your other player already, first of all, congratulations on your marriage. But second of all, the question of how do I make my game into a screwball comedy may not be relevant, because if you're doing that, if you're capable of doing that, you're doing it anyway. And if you're able to do it in a hard-boiled riff of seriousness in regular one-to-one, just as Robin says, putting on the guardrails, or in this case, taking the guardrails off of being silly and freewheeling and riffing off each other, means you're going to fall into it almost naturally. It seems unfair. It's like, how do I learn to be a figure skater? Well, first you begin as a talented figure skater, and then you just practice. My theory is that for two people to be able to do Screwball, they kind of already have to have that vibe. And if they don't have that vibe, they're not going to be able to talk themselves into that vibe, and they'll feel sad and less because they did not begin with Howard Hawks writing their dialogue. I mean, even, Sheila and I are only Howard Hawksian a couple of hours a day. If we tried to do it, on command, turning the tap on and off, it might not be super successful. So I would hesitate to say that this is a thing that, you can achieve it if you just, do this, thus, and X mechanically, because you might not be able to, and it might feel bad. And I don't want people to feel bad playing one-to-one, because literally the great thing about one-to-one is there's no one to make you feel bad. You're already with someone who wants to spend 4 hours doing nothing but look at you. So that's probably a good sign.
Although in Cthulhu Confidential, Mickey Cohen does make you want to feel bad.
Right, yeah. But that's a different, that's a narrative feel bad, not a personal feel bad.
Right, and your test of how well it does may not be how funny was it, but rather how light and engaging and relaxing it was. And so the question is not, do you in fact have the wit that 30s screenwriters created for William Powell and Myrna Loy, but just did you have a nice, fun, relaxing time with kooky characters? And that's, I think, probably more achievable. Yes, we have Ruth agreeing about how scary Mickey Cohen is. Yes, we have Ruth agreeing about how scary Mickey Cohen is. So our next question will be from Jamie.
Hi. Yeah, I was getting ready to run a campaign in just the Paris section of the King role-playing game when my players decided to indulge in a little location rejection. They don't want to play in Paris. So if you had to transplant it to another city, what one would you choose?
Well, the question is, what is their objection to Paris, and what other location would meet that objection?
Well, various reasons, but they're quite keen on Venice, which makes sense for a lot of reasons. But I didn't know whether it seemed a little on the nose with all the masks and stuff.
Well, they've already answered your question. I believe the answer is everyone whose players reject Paris should choose Venice.
Yeah.
And so that obviously means doing research, but there's Venice in any time frame is incredibly atmospheric and fun, and I have not done a dive into 1895 Venice, but I bet there's all sorts of exciting things that your players have now forced you to do a lot of research about.
And once you're doing research, don't feel like you're constrained to 1895. You may find that Venice during the Futurist movement is more interesting because you've got film is coming on. The Venice Film Festival is under Mussolini, so it's probably a little bit out of period for the Futurists. But Gabriele D'Annunzio is running around, and he's nuts. You've got a lot of possibilities. And so if you're looking at the history of Venice and you're like, oh my God, why isn't this in the 19-teens? That'd be great. Feel free to move it. I mean, once you're moving it out of Robin's carefully constructed backdrop, not that Robin feels bad about that, not that Robin worked hard to give everyone something fun, but no, he's used to that. He's used to that kind of rejection. I would say, play in the era. Don't feel like, I have to play in 1895. Because it says 1895. I mean, it said Paris, and you rejected that. So anything that happens after, say, 1890, which is when in the story universe the play appears, is around 1890 or 1891. Anything that happens after that is fair game. You could play during Mussolini's Venice if you wanted to have fascism equals Castaigne out there or equals Carcosa in big letters, and you could look at creepy weirdos around Mussolini, of whom I am sure there were a plenitude. Or, I mean, I personally, if they're rejecting Paris and they didn't have a city in mind, I would ask them what city they had in mind. But, you might want to just say, this is for the other people watching this later, maybe, play in a city that you know super well and can fall back on. So if I were running it and we're not running it in Paris, which, by the way, would not happen, Chicago in the 1890s is also insane and pregnant and full of creative weirdos, from L. Frank Baum to Frank Lloyd Wright, and that's just people with F and L in their initials. And so I would say pick a place that you know well, and then, like I said, don't feel constrained to 1895 if you're not constraining yourself to Paris anyway.
Next up, we have a beloved Pelgraniste colleague, Steve Dempsey. Steve, have you frozen? Okay, we'll skip over Steve momentarily. Womzilla.
Hey there. For anyone who hasn't been reading the chat, Kat Tobin did post the Discord link in there, so thank you for that, Kat. I have an annoying habit of trying to find influences in game design and everything else. And one thing that's been nagging at me, well, not nagging is the wrong word, I'm sorry. I'm having a bit of motor mouth.
One thing that's been keeping you up at night.
Yes, it absolutely has.
One thing that has been obsessing you, like a call from the deep somehow, causing you to make bomb release.
Like a cursed shock card or something.
Exactly.
When you first described the shock and injury mechanism, which I know began in Cthulhu Confidential, I thought this is the mature version of the status cards from Tales of the Arabian Nights. Is that me just grasping at things I know, or was there any conscious influence there at all?
I'm sad to inform you that I'm not familiar with that game.
Okay.
The ultimate genesis of that, of course, is trading card games, right? These are exceptions-based status cards. So this comes out of my work on Shadowfist and On the Edge, and the card text descriptions and the the use of sort of standard terms and the attempt to have really tight descriptions of everything that are consistent is if it comes from anywhere, it's from there.
And that technology, of course, began basically with Cosmic Encounter.
Right.
First big exceptions-based board game. And I suspect that what you're seeing is that Tales of the Arabian Nights, based as it is on overlapping conditions, is probably, and I know nothing about the design process of that, is someone looking at something like Dungeons and Dragons, which involves imposing conditions on each other, and taking that and reading it through the exceptions-based board game mechanic. And so where you're seeing the commonality is that I suspect the Tales of the Arabian Nights was at least potentially done by people who are familiar with role-playing games that involved exceptions-based play.
Well, I mean, it was Eric Goldberg and Greg Kostikian who, like the year before, had published Cosmic Encounter at West End. So excellent spotting, and I'm kind of stunned at myself for never having realized that. So thank you. You've taught me something.
Well, as long as you can sleep at night, that's our real goal.
That is
primarily sleep therapists.
Yeah, yeah. And as soon as we figure that out, we'll use it on ourselves. Oh, Steve, you're such a tease. Okay, Ken Ringwald.
Hi. So you mentioned the Dreamlands a few times. I was just wondering if you had any tips to make the Dreamlands really distinctive and especially modern in like a Delta Green game.
I'm actually getting ready to plunge my Fall of Delta Green players into the Dreamlands, and I'm sort of working that out myself. I have a couple of thoughts. First of all, my general notion is, although my players run the gamut in Lovecraft familiarity, I mean, some of them have never read him, some of them have read a bunch of him, so it's not that I really need, to hit, oh, we have to go to Ulthar and do things, though they have been in Ulthar, but the sort of the specific symbolist descriptions that Lovecraft engages in, I think that you can sort of abstract back out, and then if over the course of the game, the players have indicated that their characters have specific psychological hang-ups, obsessions, phobias, areas of concern, feed those elements back in. So I would say personalize the Dreamlands to the players. So if you've got, for example, a situation in which they're worried about losing their hand because a lot of your players have somehow lost their characters have somehow lost their hand in the course of the game, I would say hands and handlessness should be a thing that you feed back in. And then in terms of making it modern and not like a 1870s landscape painting, that's going to be down to what is the sensibility that you're looking for. I mean, I don't say add machine guns and radio to the Dreamlands. I think that sort of violates the point of it, because if you wanted a machine gun and radio setting, you could do that in Earth. But I think that making the Dreamlands, first of all, making them less welcoming is a good start, because if you're in a legitimate nightmare realm where you don't know what's happening next, that should be strange and unsettling. And then if you feel like, oh, I want to provide the characters a happiness place, a Celephas or whatever, an Uthnar guy, you can say, tell me what is Grace's happiest memory of a dream she had as a kid, and then the player will feed you back and say, oh, I dreamed that I was with my pony Snowball and we were riding around in a field of clover. And so when you get to Uthnar guy in that Dreamlands, it's covered in clover and ponies, and she, oh, great. And so it's a personal recognition. I think rather than trying to make the Dreamlands modern, making them personal is the direction to go, because then the players will respond personally to it. And then the modernity comes from the fact that it's just as alienating and horrible a place as the real world once they figure out that it's mythos central with, Men of Lang and Nyarlathotep and whatnot, Shantak birds. And so, when she's out there playing with the pony and a Shantak bird comes scraping down off of Mount Kadath and grabs up a pony and carries it away and eviscerates it in midair, and the blood just keeps raining forever, then that's dreamy. That's, archetypally feeling, and it also deliberately messes with them in a way that it wouldn't if you just had a Shantak bird fly down and grab a fat sheep outside Hathag or something.
My notion of the Dreamlands is that after the Surrealists mess it up in the 20s and 30s, that it sort of goes frozen during World War II, which is inspired by a Leonora Carrington painting of Max Ernst, and then the 60s pop art scene revives it when they revive Surrealism. So for Fall of Delta Green, though, what I would say is the Dreamlands in the late 60s are J.G. Ballard's Atrocity Exhibition. That's very clearly, when you read it, is a description of the Dreamlands. I think there may even be an explicit nod or two in there. And what you would do if you're doing contemporary Delta Green is you would draw on our contemporary sources of unease. So, there might be a Black Lodge in there. That's all I'm saying. On our contemporary sources of unease. So, there might be a Black Lodge in there. That's all I'm saying. And Steve Dempsey, as a seasoned storyteller, has created extreme suspense around whether we will be able to call him up now. So this is our third attempt to summon Steve Dempsey. Steve.
Hi, is that working?
There you are.
Steve Dempsey, everybody. And of course, this question has got to be a killer because we've waited for it so long.
Well, I was going to ask about how to run political gaming, but there's a massive pile of books behind one of you and a big pile of DVDs behind the other. So can you pull one out from each stack and tell us how wonderful it is?
Well, what I have behind me are actually CDs. My DVDs are downstairs. Well, my political game would be Verdi's Macbeth. You don't get any better than Macbeth for a political game. It's got all the killing and regret and terror, and it's got witches. And this version comes with a soundtrack courtesy of Giuseppe Verdi. So the killing in real world politics is sometimes metaphorical, but it sure isn't in Shakespeare's Macbeth. And Shakespeare gives you all the political drama that I think you would ever want to go on. And I guess it's not at all unlucky on an online platform to say the word Macbeth over and over again.
Over and over. You'll summon him up just like Castor.
Yes. The Scottish DVD box set.
Mm-hmm. I would say that the pulling things off my shelf, off my book without toppling them, that the book that I got here is Richard Spence's excellent book on Aleister Crowley and British intelligence, Secret Agent 666, a great title, fun had by all. This is everything that is known and maybe a little more about that fraught topic. And if you allow a political game to extend into the machinations of the intelligence system, as we have demonstrably noticed that it does, I think that would be a good basis. Is maybe you're not playing Crowley, that would be a big ask, and also he's very horrible and should be an NPC, but playing members of the British security state who are trying to weaponize or not weaponize Aleister Crowley, and is it real magic, and is he just a crazy person who is weaponizing credulousness instead of Charonzon? That's sort of a low stakes but creepily realistic study, because obviously with your MK Ultras and whatnot, you have plenty of examples of people saying, why should we waste all these cultists on shady guys from the Midwest in sunglasses when we could run them as CIA fronts or MI6 fronts, and then we could use them and they would be helpful to us. There is a documented program that Miles Copeland set up that was called the Occultists in High Places, OHP program, that was attempting to seed various third world governments with occult believers so that then the CIA could manipulate their astrologer or whatnot in sort of a scale-up model of Operation Mistletoe from World War II. So I think that there's a lot of pregnant possibility, even if you never have occultism in the world, of various members of the intelligence community trying to decide, are we running cultists? And the slow realization that, oh, right, belief that our intelligence agency is functional is also cult belief. We are the same. We're just, we also have drunk the Kool-Aid and believe something that there's no empirical evidence for, and meet in secret and have second names. And oh my God, we're just boring Satanists. This is terrible. So you can have that as sort of a a realizational moment, and then obviously you can take that same realization and flavor it up as luridly as you like, depending on how deep into the Dennis Wheatley you want to get. And obviously, all the way deep is a perfectly legitimate answer. There's no reason to run things in a quotidian natural space if you don't want to.
Unlike an in-person convention, there's no one coming through the door to hold up their hand to tell us to shut up and get out so that the miniatures painting panel can start. But we've been here for a while, and I was talking earlier about the comfort of sitting in your computer chair. So we're going to do one more question, and that question is from James Holloway.
Woo!
Hey, in my recent attempts at historical or time travel gaming, I ran some Time Watch recently, and it's a bit of a departure for me to run historical games that aren't kind of mystery or horror themed, right? Time Watch, kind of that sort of cop action comedy sort of a premise. And I ran into the unexpected problem that history is kind of a giant downer. Like,
oh, you noticed that, did you?
Yeah. Over the years, I've picked that up.
If only we could generalize that to some sort of political or theological insight. Oh, probably not.
Right, but this does mean, well, yeah, and I suppose if we can have comedy set in the miserable modern world, we can do this.
Death of Stalin demonstrates anything can be funny.
That is true. So maybe the answer to my question is simply to go with a black comedy. But there's that. I was looking through it, and there's sort of this suggestion, like, oh well, this.
You've muted, James.
How about now?
Now
Here we go.
All right, great. So, in short, when running more lighthearted genres in historical settings, what are some tips that you have for preventing people from dwelling on all the slavery and oppression?
I mean, with some things, it's just a matter of like any other topic that you want to. I mean, this is like the opposite of X-carding out because you're choosing sort of ignorance and lightheartedness. But you can say, like right now, I'm running Hellenistica, and at the very beginning of the game, I said, everyone here is a grown-up. Many of you have advanced degrees in history. You know as well or better than I do that the actual Hellenistic era is supported by an immense slave economy. Do you want any of that in the game? And to a person, they said, we're all right. We don't want that. That will not be fun. And so we just don't talk about it. And so they need
to be the fun pirates.
Exactly. We meet servants, not slaves. When they sack a city, I do not say, well, you could make a lot more money if you sold all the Persians into slavery. Just saying. That is off the table. They're not meeting Dramakos, who is a real-life slave revolt Robin Hood, who took over the island of Chios and ran it for 20 years as a free slave area. There's lots of great drama around the topic that I'm also putting off the table. But yeah, we're the fun pirates. And if you think of yourself as a Hollywood screenwriter, certainly of the Golden Age or Hays Code era, and you're like, well, yes, we're all aware of the implicit oppression of the Tudor regime, but also people like puffy shirts. So just have a sword fight. Back off, friends, Boaz. We're doing an adventure movie. And so just give into your inner, Jack Warner, I think is the answer. Make sure that the players are good with it, because if you've got players who are like, no, the reason I wanted to play a fun Civil War adventure or a Civil War adventure is because I wanted to dig into the question of slave liberation. I wanted that to be a big part of it. I want to help John Brown out, or I want to, guarantee those 40 acres and a mule that Sherman gave everyone in South Carolina and had to take back. If that's the goal of the game, then maybe interrogating the awful, even by way of an unrealistic, well, thanks to my time intervention, we've solved racism. There we go. Good job, everyone. Even if you're doing a sort of a Norman Lear level of facile approach to the topic, you have to engage with your players first and see what they want. And if they want to interrogate it at whatever level, it's relatively easy to make an adventure story about that just as easily as it is to make it about the good old forces of reaction and oppression who have the puffy shirts. I mean, if you haven't read it, I know you've read it, but if people haven't read it, Orwell wrote a great essay called On Boys' Stories, where he said, how come communists can't have adventure fiction? What's wrong with that? Right now, every right-thinking boy in England grows up reading horrible reactionary swill. We should have communist adventure fiction. And if you read On Boys' Stories, you'll have a million great ideas for, let's go and help Eugene Debs murder Woodrow Wilson. And it's like, great, everyone can get behind that. That's a good story.
A way to start off by doing that is by saying that we are doing the idealized light entertainment version of this era. So you say, well, this is the CW version of the Tudors. And so all of your characters are good-looking young people of a variety of multicultural appearances, and it's just never addressed. There's as long as you're super good-looking, you're in this world, and everybody looks. This is a world where everybody's, just as. In any historical movie, everybody is exquisitely made up and has the fashionable current hairstyles somewhat modified. We're doing the fun version of this, and it's a stylized story that is deliberately making the choice to not go to very difficult territory, because whenever one of those CW shows does acknowledge, for example, on Legends of Tomorrow, they decided to do and let's acknowledge slavery episode. It was like, oh, maybe we shouldn't have.
Yeah.
Maybe that wasn't the best tonal combination.
Yeah, you might not be the people to make that statement.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. That's Green Arrow and Green Lantern that make that statement.
Exactly.
Travel around America in a car. You can't punch child poverty in the face with a green boxing glove. Ow. Yeah, I can. I have a will. I can do anything.
Well, on that note, I would like to thank everybody for popping by and helping us with this experiment. I think it worked pretty well, and I'm very gratified to have so many people show up. So we're going to work out what other future Pelgrane panels are going to be. Obviously, I think we could just do this a bunch of times, but we want to keep the community of gaming together, and the community of Cartest listeners, and the community of Pelgrane players together, and feeling that we're all in this, and that our isolation is physical, not intellectual. And so we're going to go forward with figuring out stuff. If some people have just learned that there's a new brand spanking new Pelgrane Discord, if you want to, and certainly the overlap between that and Ken and Robin talks about stuff is essentially 100%. So anyone who wants to join us on that, please do so, and let us know what other panels you would like us to tackle. There's obviously other people on the team who can take part in seminars and panels as well. We have a bunch of ideas, but we would also like to hear yours. So I'd like to thank Ken for joining me, for Kat for holding up her messages in her video window, and for all of you for joining us and making this experiment work out as well as it has. So thanks, everybody, and we'll catch you on the flip side. Take care.